Hello, everybody. Good day to you. Welcome to we're going to call this an experimental video. I am at my desk and I'm editing the Ford F-150 clutch/drive shaft job video. And while I was waiting for some upload action to happen, I was going through some comments on that particular video. And something kind of caught my eye and I wanted to talk about it a little bit. The comment says, "How would you handle this situation? 2008 New York Rusty Forester, changing ball joints and crack in the control arm while trying to spread it open to remove the ball joint." So it's in for service for a ball joint, and they can't get the control arm and the steering knuckle removed, I'm assuming, and they end up breaking. Looks like they broke the control arm. I guess they're trying to press it out, so they broke the control arm and press the thing out. I didn't know those were press out ball joints. Hang on, let me look that up real quick. All right, so I went into my shop management system and I made a fictitious order for a 2008 Subaru Forester. I wasn't sure which trim it was, so I just picked the base trim. Regardless, it appears that the ball joint is an integral part of the control arm. So if you have a bad ball joint in that car, then they're going to want to replace the control arm. So the control arm labor for one side, including a ball joint, is 0.8 hours. Realistically, being up in New York, there's probably a markup matrix, let's call it like, I don't know, 20 to 30% on heavily rusted vehicles. And one could expect that to be a normal practice because it's going to take longer, and no matter what the job, and you know it's going to take longer. So realistically, you would have to bill for a longer estimated time. So some shops can build in just an automatic multiplier. So if the book calls for 1 hour, it will actually bill for 1.2 to 1.3 hours. Going back to the part where you said they cracked the control arm while they were trying to spread it open, I'm going to assume that you meant the steering knuckle, because the ball joint presses into the steering knuckle, and I believe that there's a bolt that runs through that kind of clamps down and secures itself to that stud on the ball joint. So I'm assuming that they couldn't get the ball joint free from the steering knuckle, and they ended up breaking the steering knuckle. Now, it's always good practice that when you get into a position where you start to have to apply more force than necessary, that's when it's time to stop and regroup and have a conversation about what might be required moving forward. You can't just, send it with a 4-foot long pry bar and a ball joint separator and smack it with a hammer and then, hope for the best, because it'd be great if it works that way in real life, but that's how you break things. So what I'm getting at is it really depends on how the thing ended up breaking in half or cracking, or I'm not sure how it failed, but it depends on the context of the situation. If they had the proper tool applied in the proper fashion, and during the removal process, the steering knuckle broke and everything was being done, accordingly, then I wouldn't say it was negligence. So you could assume that the liability for that broken steering knuckle would then be on the owner of the car. And again, we have to circle back to having these open lines of communication and having these update conversations with the vehicle owner. So we're going to assume that the process has been followed and we all are aware of the risks here, and no excessive force or negligence was used in the breaking of the component. That changes the overall scope of the job. So the way I would price that is, number one, we know we need a ball joint. That's a cheap part and it's relatively inexpensive to replace. But now the small job has turned into a bigger job, which involves pressing a wheel bearing into the steering knuckle. So I'm looking at the labor guide and I see remove and replace the steering knuckle. That's one side. It calls for 3.3 hours of labor. There's another labor line for remove and replace front wheel bearing. That's also for one side, and that requires 3.7 hours of labor. So the way this is calculated is, if you're going to replace a steering knuckle, I'm assuming that the labor guide is calculating in pressing in a new wheel bearing with that new replacement steering knuckle. Hence the lower labor cost than the labor line for removing and replacing a wheel bearing, because the job of keeping the steering knuckle and replacing the bearing requires the knuckle to be removed. You take the assembly over to a press, you set it up in a press, you have to press the wheel hub out, flip the assembly over, reset it up, press the bearing out, flip it over again, press the bearing in, then you press the hub back in, then you have to reassemble it back on the vehicle. So I think that's why there's a discrepancy in those two labor lines. Anyway, I digress. When it comes to how to price that in this particular situation, I would go with the highest labor line first, 3.7 hours. And if this thing is extremely rusted and the bolts are going to have to be replaced, I'd probably round it up to 4 or 4.5 hours. But again, these are conversations you have to have up front. Now, when it comes to the ball joint, seeing as how the control arm has to take place, there is overlapping labor in this particular situation. So you don't get to charge the 3.7 original hours plus the full boat on the ball joint / control arm labor. You can add in a couple of tenths in this situation, but this is one of those, we'll call it a loophole. And what I mean is a person that doesn't realize the process of combining multiple jobs together won't understand how to combine the labor quotes together either. So if I'm charging 4 hours for a wheel bearing or a steering knuckle, then I don't get to add the 0.8 or the hour to include the ball joint, because the ball joint has to be disconnected in order to replace the steering knuckle. Does that make sense? Now, there are a couple extra bolts, and then you probably have a sway bar link involved and maybe a wiring harness that runs to a wheel speed sensor. So you do get to bill a few tenths, maybe 30 to 40%, perhaps 50% if there's rust. Again, you have to have the experience to be able to kind of foresee how this blends together, and then you end up in a situation that's fair to the customer and to the technician. I guess to simplify it, we don't get to add 4 hours plus 3.3 hours plus 0.8 hours plus a wheel alignment. We don't get to just stack all those up as if they're linear. You'll end up charging 8 or 9 hours for maybe a 4.5 or a 5 hour job. To sum it all up, here's how the experience would go with me. You bring me a very rusty vehicle and we take a look at it, and I find things wrong with it, or you need something done to it that you know of, like a ball joint, for example. And we take a look and I go, hang on, this might not go as easily as we all would like to. So here's our best case scenario. And if it doesn't go the way that we want, here's what could happen next. And if that doesn't go the way that we want, here's what could happen next. And our absolute worst case scenario, the one we're all trying to avoid, looks like this on paper. And you got to have those conversations up front, and then you can move forward with a clear thought process, and everybody's in communication and on the same page, and we know how this is going to play out ultimately. The question is what's going to happen when we get in there? People actually can be very reasonable if you set the expectations the right way and maintain communication. A customer brings a car in, they said this is broken. Technician doesn't care. They go, yeah, you're right, that's broken. Service advisor says, okay, that broken thing cost this much money. The technician now has a job to fix this one particular broken thing for X amount of money. And their only goal is to complete that job, whatever that is. People get short-sighted and they can't see the big picture on what they're doing. So the technician, determined to complete that job, breaks something. So then they go to management or the service advisor and they say, hey, I broke this. So that person calls the customer and they say, hey, this broke. Unfortunately, it's going to cost this much money to fix it. So how did it really break? Nobody knows, and there's nothing to back up the claim from either side, because the customer will go, you broke that, you should fix it. And a technician is going to go, it came in broken and it broke more while I was trying to fix it. So one side's going to say the other side's responsible for whatever it's going to cost to complete that repair. And that's not fair for either party. However, again, it can be solved by following the correct process and setting expectations and maintaining communication. So I hope that kind of answers the question. At least that's my take on the situation. I think that's the fairest method possible for all parties involved. And I just simply can't stress enough to keep to the process at all times and always try to think at least one step ahead. So let me know what you guys think about this experimental type of video. Use the like or dislike buttons at your discretion. And if you have any opinions on the matter, please feel free to let me know about that in the comment section down below. If you guys like it, maybe I'll do more. And if you don't like it, then I won't do any more. So having said that, again, thank you guys for watching. Have yourselves a great day. See you guys later.